Homage to the Triple Gem. So hello everybody, this is Bhante Joe here, and I'm here at Nikapiti Aranya. This is a lovely Aranya. Jnanadeepa Bhante actually had a kuti in the forest behind where this main monastery is located, and they later built the monastery here on this site, possibly influenced by the fact that it was previously a location where Jnanadeepa Bhante had stayed. So the forest is very inspiring, kind of inward pushing, a little bit intense with a lovely stream at the back. So it's quite a nice place to stay. So was asked a question the other day about politics, basically, and monks don't usually comment on politics. It's not really the role of a monk, the specialty of a monk, and there's different reasons why monks don't do that. But this question was specifically about an article that this gentleman had read, written by a monk, in which he said that basically there's an ultra-right wing faction growing within Buddhism that includes positions on issues like homophobia, transphobia, climate change denial, incel culture, fans of Jordan Peterson. Things like this, a range of culture war issues that, there's Buddhists who are taking like a right-wing side to these things. So the question that this gentleman asked, another thing that the article had said was that to say that one shouldn't get involved in politics is basically a right-wing position, or like one shouldn't take stances on these political issues, or get involved with them, perhaps on like a somewhat more worldly level, to more involved advisory role on a worldly level. That basically, for monks to say that they shouldn't be involved with these things, or lay people to say that they shouldn't be involved with these things as Buddhists, is elevationist and is essentially a right-wing position. It's kind of like I guess letting the right wing run rampant, or that there's some kind of unstated right-wing agenda within this statement that you shouldn't get involved. So his question was, he said, is this far-left framing, those were his words, in line with the Dhamma and the early Buddhist texts? And he said he was kind of shocked by the language in these things. So there's a few questions that are inherent in this, and funny trying to address this question in a video. I think this is like take number 3, because monks don't usually talk about politics, and to break this down is not something that comes kind of natural when somebody is necessarily talking about the Dhamma. So within these questions, there's a few different ones. One is basically, is there this kind of this infiltration of a far left perspective into Buddhism? That was kind of it's one of the things that he'd asked is this in line with the Dhamma, or is this like an infiltration from like a far left perspective? Another one is it elevationism, like to say that monks should step back from the world, shouldn't be involved in politics or political issues? Is this something that's in line with the Dhamma? And a third unstated one is the question: is this saying that these people are extremists for being fans of Jordan Peterson, or if they're homophobic or transphobic, or these terms are very broad actually, and they can cover like a wide range of opinions, and you'd have to really discuss what do you mean by that on like a case-by-case basis. But his question is more or less, is this kind of saying that these things are extreme views, is that in line with the Dhamma, to label these positions as extreme? And also implied is to say that Buddhism, like whatever the particular left-wing perspective is that also in line with the Dhamma? Is the Dhamma actually like a left-wing thing that's in line with all these political ideologies that exist now on the left side of the spectrum? So it's a complicated issue, because the Dhamma doesn't actually neatly fit into like packages of left wing and right wing. So on the topic of whether or not these are like extreme views, like the extreme like right view or the extreme left view. Are these things that are in line with the Dhamma? To what extent are they in line with the Dhamma? And should Buddhists or monks just basically take positions that are in line with a left-wing perspective, as if the left wing is always going to be something that's in line with the Dhamma, as opposed to the right wing? So one thing to understand with these issues is that left wing and right wing, in terms of the poles of the political spectrum, those positions are always changing. So when I was young, actually, like what it meant to be left wing versus right wing, that was pretty different from what it is now. I mean, even I came to Sri Lanka about 5 years ago, and I left the monastery before that about 3 years before. So about 8 years total now since I finished my Nisai, and basically haven't been living under teachers. In that period of time, the poles of the political spectrum, just like these 8 years, have shifted quite a lot to the point, monks, you kind of, you come in and out of cultures, really. You're not so familiar with the on the ground workings of what's going on in a culture. I mean, you're somewhat separated from it. And, coming back to Canada recently, I mean, I noticed that the poles had shifted, and people had told me that they didn't really pay much attention to it. But then there was this presidential election that was coming up, and some of the stakes seemed, sometimes monks will actually learn some of the things, what's going on in politics, if they could have like a really serious and direct impact, practical impact on their lives or the lives of the people they might get involved with. This is a kind of gray area. So I was kind of following the presidential election and some of these social issues, and some of them are actually quite far apart on the political scale from what they were 8 years ago. I mean, now it's almost like the right wing is like, should we have democracy or dictatorship? I mean, that was, when I was young, that was not even like a question on the agenda. It's kind of, in Western political systems, it was just taken for granted that democracy was good, dictatorship was bad. I mean, now the right wing in countries that are like, sometimes like formerly democratic bulwarks against fascism in World War II, those countries are like, the right wing is almost like pro-dictatorship. So that's a really big change from what it was. And the left wing also has gone, has changed from what it was. There was this movie that came out when I was a young, I think before I came to the monastery. It's called Tropic of Thunder with Ben Stiller. And when I was looking at these kind of political things about, or looking into these political things, this is one of the little anecdotes that came up, was that in this movie there was this Robert Downey Jr. played this black guy or white guy who thought he was such a good actor that he portrayed a black guy in the movie. It was kind of funny, like, I mean, as a black guy myself, I didn't really even think anything of it. Like, it's kind of just like something funny. And now apparently that things have become so sensitive, you could just never even approach a topic like that at all. So it's not to weigh in on like whether these things are correct or incorrect for society, whether they're good or bad. It's to emphasize from a Buddhist perspective that the poles of what's left wing and right wing are always changing, and the poles of what's considered extreme are always changing. Like, so these changes are, you could say, they're an extreme change from what they were before. But this what's extreme and what's not is pretty relative. I mean, even what we might say, like what the right wing is now, it could go further right than that, and it has in the past. We don't have to look that far back in history to see what it means to go further right than that. The left wing was typically economic. Some of the social issues that are being brought up with the left wing are quite new. So it's dangerous to say that the Dhamma is left wing and just leave it at that and slot the Dhamma into every single left wing social issue that there is. One of the important things to understand regarding the question of whether or not like a left wing extremist perspective has infiltrated Buddhist communities is that in the West, Buddhism has typically been affiliated with communities that are more left-leaning because it was those communities that adopted Buddhism foundationally. So left is generally seen as progressive, willing to be open to new ideas, willing to be like accepting, a little bit more free socially, willing to spend money on social programs. The right has generally been seen as conservative, wanting to go back to traditional values, wanting to spend less money on social programs, being smaller government, these kind of things, pro-military. It can go, further than that. So we won't get into this. It's not a discussion on the political spectrum, because I think people might want to get that information from, political pundits rather than a monk, and there's good reason for that. But the Buddhism originally came through this left-wing movement, which was hippie, we call like hippieism, or the countercultural revolution of the 1960s. Before that, Western culture was really heavily influenced by Christianity. Even when I was young in the 80s, Christianity still played a pretty vital force, it seemed, from my memory, in society in what we might call like my mother's generation. Although that was the 60s generation, there was still a pretty strong Christian element in society and in the institutions of society. So when I was young, we would have to listen to Christmas carols and these things in school. I don't think they do that anymore. It was just taken for granted that the base of Canadian culture was Christian. And so everybody had to learn that. You just knew about Christian culture. You knew about Christianity from growing up in Canada, even if you weren't Christian. So again, not going to comment on whether that's good or bad. Leave that to the pundits. But it's to say that conservatism, a little bit of a tongue twister, in the West is going to be traditionally was trying to conserve Christian culture, Christian values, and the other aspects of Western culture that could be considered traditional. Like things that arose through the European Enlightenment, which sometimes opposed Christianity, but they were all part of this mix of what conservatives were trying to freeze in time or preserve from whatever they saw was a particular great age, which again, the perceptions of when that age is can change over time. But because of this, Buddhism would not have had an opportunity to come in through the right pole of the political spectrum in the West. It would have to come through the West, or through the left. And it did when there was this backlash against the kind of, you might call repressive social structures. That's a politically charged word, but rigid could be used compared to what they are now. Rigid social structures of race, caste, gender, etc. that existed especially in the 1950s United States. And there was a certain disillusionment with the youth because they got conscripted to go into Vietnam to fight an ideological war. And this has been going on throughout Western history, is kind of people get these ideologies and they go to war actually over philosophies, over philosophical points that can seem pretty minor. It's kind of, people go to war, kill each other. This is such an evil philosophy. It's going to spread and destroy the world, so we better kill them all. And better get people to go and engage in killing for this. So the Vietnam War, people eventually started to feel why are we going and dying to protect this political ideology and fighting and dying way over here. This has been going on for centuries, and it just seemed to be maybe a straw that had broken the camel's back. In the United States, looking back at all these different times people had gone to war for religion, for whatever ideology, and the wars just seemed to keep happening. So this countercultural revolution was no more wars, basically turned almost every social norm on its head, gender norms, sexual identity norms, racial norms, the way became open for all those things, and religious norms. And it was within this hippie movement that people started looking to religions aside from Christianity, like Hinduism, and then also Buddhism. So some of these seekers, these religious seekers in this, countercultural revolution, a lot of them were really into drugs, but they went there to India, and some of them actually went to Thailand, Burma, encountered Buddhism, and even practiced Buddhism sometimes in India, and then came back to the West. And that was one of the main ways in which Buddhism penetrated the West. So it started from its foundational culture was left-leaning. So what you'll tend to find is that wherever a culture, in whatever way a culture is founded, a system is founded, a human system is founded, that tends to have a really lasting effect for a long, long time. So we associate Buddhism with the left wing in the West because it started with the left wing. And actually, a lot of the principles that they were looking for to, counter like rampant militarism, caste, racial, gender distinctions, they were, like compared to today, they were much more extreme then. Actually, I remember, again, just going back to my childhood, growing up in the 80s, I mean, race was a thing then. You could feel it and people would comment on it, and not in nice ways. And, like you wouldn't be allowed, some kids, their mothers wouldn't let you, if you were black, some kids wouldn't let, their parents wouldn't let their kids play with you. Teachers would, teachers, at least one teacher made comments about it in class, like racially charged comments, even though that was kind of illegal at the time. And it was just generally in the air, kind of race, and homophobia was a real thing then. Like if you were a gay person, even in the 80s, the laws had been changed in Canada at that time so that it was no longer illegal to be gay. But it was still a huge social stigma. Like I think you might lose your job in certain industries if people found out you were gay. It was people wouldn't want to associate with you. You could lose friends. You could become a pariah, basically be blacklisted in some cases, some communities. So it was pretty extreme then. So you can find obviously support for not discriminating against people in these ways in Buddhism. I mean, the Buddha was anti-caste. That everybody, people should be judged on their actions rather than their groups. You can find a lot of support for these things. So coming to the left, coming to this kind of left-wing movement, taking the Buddhist principles and applying it to them, I mean, you can find a lot of things that are synergistic. So because it started that way, what can tend to happen is that anything that doesn't fit into this mold, that's left-wing, that gets either explained away, sometimes in very convoluted ways, or it just doesn't get talked about. Or the people who do talk about it, there's this kind of cancel culture where they will be shunned or they will be like, almost excommunicated. And some of these issues around bhikkhuni ordination are an example of how politically charged and divisive some of these issues can become, even within the Buddhist community. So, again, not to get into these like issues on a case-by-case basis, but it's to say that the left-wing perspective that is in Buddhism, we call it like left-wing, that comes from a foundational culture. And it's not all wrong. I mean, there is obviously left-wing elements. Now, the important thing to recognize about the Dhamma is that there are also elements in the Dhamma that we would consider right-wing from what is now a left-wing perspective. And they're plain to see. They're right there in the suttas. They're there in the Vinaya. And they're often, again, not talked about, or people might be unwilling to speak about them or afraid to speak about them for fear of this kind of like cancel culture that exists. You become a pariah and nobody wants to talk to you or things like this. So that is actually an oppressive aspect that can exist in progressive cultures. I mean, the oppressive aspect obviously can exist in right-wing cultures too. So the important thing here is to look not so much at what is left-wing or right-wing in deciding whether or not like a political view on, what we would call homophobia, transphobia, transgenderism, Jordan Peterson, whatever his views are. I think he has like a whole number of them. I'm not totally up on what Jordan Peterson is teaching. But is to reference them not in terms of left or right, but in terms of what it is that the Buddha actually teaches in the suttas, and the Vinaya, not in terms of like a vague principle like compassion or kindness or whatever it might be, because there are times when the Buddha, he does things that you could say are not kind or are, not compassion. He can be very harsh to people he feels are overstepping the bounds of the Dhamma. So what you want to do is look at these issues in terms of the Dhamma itself and not in terms of like the political pole that the issue is on to decide whether or not it's a valid point or not. And to frame people as like being extreme, like these are extreme Buddhist views or these are extreme Buddhist views, it doesn't really mean anything in terms of the Dhamma. I mean, it may mean something in terms of where the political pole is at that time, but that type of language is not necessarily helpful in terms of defining whether or not it's in line with the Dhamma. So to take one issue as an example, like transgenderism. So in Buddhism, there isn't like a necessarily like a stigma against trans, like might call people born neuter or hermaphrodites, in terms of their morality, in terms of their ability to go to heaven, in terms of their ability to practice. However, in the Vinaya, if you're born neuter, which is called a pandika, then you can't ordain as a monk. Also, you can't. Monks have all these rules that apply to women and to sexuality. Those rules also apply to pandikas, and presumably they may also apply to people who are hermaphrodites. So it's a controversial issue of whether or not people who willingly undergo castration would count as a pandika. And I'll leave that, that issue can be aside. But it's just to say that there you have a perspective on transgenderism, which is both left-wing and right-wing. And, the right-wing perspectives that are there in the Vinaya are relatively easy, plain, and clear to see. But they're often not talked about or explained away. So that's a really important thing to know, is that almost all of the social issues that we might go through, if you look in the Dhamma clearly, like just in an objective way, you might find elements that are both left and right wing in there. So in terms of whether or not it's elevationism to say that monks shouldn't get involved with politics and these kind of things, this kind of elevationism is something that can be seen in the examples that the Buddha set, but it's not like totally clear, like you should never talk about politics, you should never be involved in anything worldly. The Buddha did teach about like what type of behavior it is that makes an ideal king, makes an ideal ruler. It's essentially that they keep the 5 precepts. Also, in the ideal ruler, the Chakravarti, they conquer not by force of arms, but by strength of the Dhamma. In other words, people are just so impressed with the way that they behave, that they, and their ability to govern, that they willingly want to merge with them. The king just shows up and they're like, please accept us as part of your kingdom. And then he rules that kingdom without violence or force or threats. And also, from memory, they established like medical dispensaries, medicines for people and even for animals. I think they set up righteous protection even for animals. Although I'm not 100% sure on that point. I think that's there. And then I remember reading as well another sutta in which they talk about like if people are very poor, I believe this is in the suttas, then they're more likely to commit crime. So in these ways you have like elements of the social welfare state, non-violence, non-military conquest that are more on the left-wing side, right? So the Buddha does talk about politics in this way. And monks, as followers of the Buddha, also can talk about the principles behind good governments, behind good kingship, in line with what the Buddha's talked about. However, there is a balance point and a tipping point in that one of the dangers, just checking here, I have to run for Dana before long. One of the dangers in that, in taking on, in teaching about these things, is that monks can cross a line if they start to promote a particular political party, a particular political figure, or a particular political ideology. Because again, these things are always changing. So there's an example of one of the 2 most famous monks in Thailand. And, he was believed to have psychic powers, believed to be an arhat, an extremely impressive monk. He believed to have many disciples of his who became arhats. And he actually promoted this one gentleman who became prime minister, and said that he would be a good prime minister because he was so rich he didn't need to eat. In other words, he didn't need to be corrupt because he was already so rich. And then that gentleman actually ended up, when he got into power, I think because of this monk's promotion, or aided by this monk's promotion, a lot of people voted for him. He got into power, and he ended up being corrupt on a scale that was just much higher than anybody could have maybe, or that would have generally been anticipated. And he actually ended up selling a satellite and like pocketing the money. So I mean, that's pretty corrupt. So what it goes to show is that there's actually a danger when monks get involved directly in like actively organizing political movements, actively being involved in political parties, actively supporting particular political candidates, because that gets really into the vagaries of human intention, which can change on a dime. The principles of the Dhamma are more eternal. Good kings keep the 5 precepts, they're virtuous, and when they behave that way, the whole society becomes virtuous, rains and everything fallen, good succession, there's good harvest. In other words, everybody prospers when the leaders are virtuous. I mean, you can talk about that. The Buddha also set a really important example for us, in that his his first and foremost, his foremost king disciple was King Bimbisara. He actually became a Sotapanna and donated the first forest monastery to the Buddha. It's called the Veluvana, I think. The first forest monastery. So he was actually murdered by his son, Prince Ajatasattu, who colluded with Devadatta, who tried to murder the Buddha. And after he deposed his father, the Buddha didn't start a political movement against him. He didn't try to rally his followers, which he had many, or to even go and approach the neighboring king, King Pasenadi, who was a follower of his, and say, depose this king, he's evil, which he obviously was. He just kept teaching the Dhamma in the same way that he normally did. One of the teachings that was there in the Dhamma, which he didn't rescind or repeal, was that if you kill your father, you're definitely going to hell. So what actually ended up happening later on was that this king, he actually ended up going to see the Buddha, listened to a discourse from him, and was so impressed that he actually took refuge in the Buddha, and even ended up sponsoring the first council. So, however, at the end, after the king had left, the Buddha said, the king, his fate is sealed because of his actions, basically. If he hadn't killed his father, that good man, he would have become a stream mentor while he was sitting in that seat. So this is the example that the Buddha sets for us as monks, is that you don't get into basically organizing political demonstrations, political movements. It can be dangerous for the Sangha as a whole. If the Sangha comes to be seen as a political entity, then it's going to suffer the vagaries of political fortune, and it's going to require the resources that political parties do. And they don't get those resources in line with the Dhamma. I mean, if you're going to be a monk who gets into politics, you're going to be subject to attacks from your rival politicians or political forces. And the way that lay people and lay political organizations weather that is they have stores of money, and they canvass for donations. They do all kinds of different things that are not allowed by the Vinaya. So it's going to take the monastic lifestyle in a direction that is not conducive to Nibbana. And as far as monks, getting into politics directly, like becoming MPs or like running for political office, well, I mean, you can't even handle money, so that's obviously against the Vinaya. Another important point that comes from the Buddha's example is that the Dhamma should be open to everybody, regardless of their political affiliation, if they sincerely want to change and correct the bad deeds that they've done. I mean, that's got to be one of the most extreme examples. You've got an evil king who colluded with an enemy of the Sangha to try to kill the Buddha, and he's now taken the throne, and you still don't, there's still no political movement organized against him. It's incredible. It's going to be hard to find a situation more extreme than that. So even in the most extreme situations with the most depraved individuals, if they want to make a change, a sincere change, then the door should be open to them to make that change without allowing them to do harm or damage to the Sangha or the Dhamma. So that's another reason why it's not a good idea to frame political issues or to directly align the Dhamma with a particular political cause or political issue, because it should be open to everybody, regardless of the political spectrum, to tread the path to Nibbana. So this brings up another important point, is that the Buddha's teachings on politics were not something that were meant to have people stay in the world and make the world like some perfect place that would be free from any type of pain or suffering. It's just not seen as possible in Buddhism. The best you can get is a Chakravati, and there's still suffering and pain there. The Buddha's teachings are there to give people the best possible opportunity to see the way that suffering and happiness arise in their lives. And suffering and happiness arise externally, and suffering and happiness can arise from external and internal conditions. I mean, ultimately it's all internal. But you can see the effects that good actions have on your own mind and also externally, that they have on leaders, that they have on society. And if you want to make society good, then, go ahead. But it's also there so that when people do these things, they can recognize that these things are not stable, they're not permanent, and that they turn around on each other. I mean, even we've been living in this extremely prosperous and stable time, and yet, in recent political discourse, I mean, for example, the U.S. economy, I mean, this is like a little bit of objective fact. People could argue with this. I mean, I don't want to get into political talk, but it's very strong. And yet people came to believe that it was very weak, that it was really terrible. And, there was this coronavirus scare, and you just look at the objective numbers. But what tends to happen is that people get bored of particular political situations over time. People can even get bored of peace. Peace can seem boring. So there was reading up, listening to these things, there was this one very famous fellow. He's saying, well, you wouldn't want to have peace all the time because maybe there'd be no progress. Maybe everything just stagnates. It's like that's the kind of perspective people can get. When peace becomes normal. And this is a function of craving. It's recognized in economics that basically the more you have of something, the less valuable it becomes. And this can be the case with peace, wealth, just about anything. So loss follows on gain, and gain follows on loss. Pain follows on pleasure, and pleasure follows on pain. This is something that people can recognize when they try to make the world as good, as stable as possible. The principles for why it doesn't always remain stable, it doesn't always remain good, it's because of craving. So if we want to find an end to the suffering that comes from this, we can't look to the world itself. So these teachings on the world are not meant to get people mired in them. They're meant to be a stepping stone. They're meant to be a way that people can see the way in which these patterns arise so that they can find a way out. Because the Dhamma ultimately is not something that's either left-wing nor right-wing. Ultimately, what we're aiming at is a state that's neither bright nor dark. The kamma that leads out of samsara is neither bright nor dark kamma. It's a kamma that leads to dispassion. It's a kamma that leads to renunciation and leads to relinquishment. Because it's in separating the mind from these things that one finds happinesses that are more and more stable. And it's in separating the mind from everything that one finds a happiness that's permanent. So it's important to frame things always in terms of the Dhamma rather than political ideologies. Like, is this, if one is saying these are like extreme right-wing views and we should get involved in politics to root them out, that may be going too far. Framing it in terms of this is against the Dhamma for this and this reason, that may be a good way to frame it. But with the intention as well that our goal, our main purpose is not to make the world a perfect place, it's to find a permanent happiness, and that is a very different thing entirely. So the Buddhist teachings on kingship, on politics are there. It's a gray area. The Buddhist teachings on some of these issues are actually there. They don't necessarily fit into clear left or right brackets. The Buddhist teachings on how monks should separate from the world, how lay people should be separate from the world, they're there. Again, they don't always fit into clear right and left brackets. But what is clear is that the Dhamma leads one way, and that leads to release. And release is not to be found in this world. It's not to be found in samsara. It's to be found apart from it. And that's what we're searching for.